physically such a strong guy, but he was not a really good skater, and he would get sooner to a limitation. Doesn't mean he's necessarily that we need to work on his fitness. Maybe, like I said before, we maybe have to work on his skills.
Welcome to the Upside Strength Podcast, your number one resource for all things fitness and performance in Switzerland. Today, I'm happy to welcome Arno Galmarini, performance coach and founder at Origym in Scuol, Switzerland. Hey, Arno, welcome to the show.
Hello, it's very nice to be here. Thank you, Sean, for having me.
No, it's a great pleasure. So for those in the audience who don't know you yet, can you give a little bit of your background?
Sure. Like a big background or just like a short one?
Like a medium one.
Okay, a medium one. All right. So I come from Scuol. It's still in the Lower Engadine Valley, and I grew up here, and I went to sports school and tried to be a snowboarder, and then it wasn't really successful. So I started studying about, because I was very interested in coaching and training. I started studying sports and moved to Zurich, worked there, and then also created my company, Elite Training, in 2011, and built a gym, actually the first gym in Switzerland, like a proper warehouse facility for athletes. We were like the first who had a turf, the green turf you haven't seen before, right. With like the power racks and stuff, where you just saw in the United States. Actually, I had an internship there, and where I got inspired, and I thought like, right. Oh, Switzerland is missing something. And it worked quite well. I could train a lot of athletes, like from all different areas, but mostly like our like, let's say specific areas were like ice hockey, skiing, snowboarding, and yeah, that I would say, yeah, that's about. Well, now I also coach mountain biking a lot because I'm very interested as well.
Cool.
And then at the end of 2018, where the gym was, the facility got closed because they had to renovate it. So I had to make a decision, and also I was in talk with people in Scuol who gave me the opportunity to do something here. And I knew it's going to be different. It's not going to be elite sports. And I also wanted to do something different, and also wanted to do something where it's all about fun, having fun. Yeah. And I created the brand Origym. And it's a lifestyle brand, and it's purely about having fun. We do workouts, very creative, unconventional. We have a really nice setting in Scuol, and it's really cool to change up my what I do, and it's really interesting. I still train some athletes, but the big work now is with Origym. So.
Yeah, so I definitely want to come back to Origym and what you've built and where you see this going in the future. But I do want to talk about the work that you do and that you also did with athletes, especially around the Moxy. So can you talk a little about how you first encountered the Moxy or the NIRS technology in general, and what you thought of it the first time around?
Yeah, I can remember the first time we got introduced to André Feldman. I think you had him before.
I did, yeah.
Because through Dominique Gisin, where we trained her, she was a professional skier back then, and she said like, hey, you need to check this out. Maybe it's interesting for you guys. And then we met André, and it was very well. The meeting was very impressive because I really like André. He's a really nice guy and really open-minded, and even though he's like an academic and knows a lot of details about physiology, etc., he was never like being cocky about it, or was very comfortable to talk to him. Right. And also at that moment, I was really like, the whole bioenergetic training was not as good as I wanted it to be. It was still a lot of was it in the shadow, or I didn't understand well. Yeah. And also it really opened my eyes for a completely new approach and new ideas. And well, in the beginning, for sure, I was like, okay, what we are talking about. What is it exactly? How does it work? And through a lot of talking with Andre, a lot of testing, we figured out actually it's quite powerful, and especially in hockey, interval sports is very interesting to work with Moxy.
So maybe let's go into that. What are some of the insights that you were able to get from Nyon's technology and from Moxy specifically that you couldn't get before without that technology?
Right. So I would say like one of the strongest points in using the Moxy was actually, well, there's a couple of points, but for sure, like how you could finally see physiologically, for example, how hard you were working and what does it mean bioenergetically wise. Also just simple things like if you do an interval, if you're planning to do a rest period, you would base it off like some empirical evidence, but never like individually. Like you would just say like, okay, everyone gets a minute. Whereas with Moxy, you actually see the recovery period. So things became visual, where before you didn't have an idea. Well, you could use a heart rate monitor, but heart rate monitor was not as precise and not as direct as like the Moxy. Also, sometimes it doesn't really fit the picture.
Right.
Also, what I would say about the Moxy is it's very versatile. You could finally do testing outside of the lab, which is a huge plus. You could think of like doing bioenergetic testing in the sport. You can actually do it on the ice, or you can do it on the mountain. Actually, we did it once with mountain bike downhillers.
Yeah.
We actually, just for fun, a little bit for fun, and also a little bit to see what's happening. We put them on the forearm, for example, and on the legs.
Okay. Yeah.
And they run down a World Cup track, and we saw what's happening, and gave us some insights about physiological responses. And also it was interesting to base it off like what the athletes felt during those sections. So also that's a huge plus, like just portable wise, and it's waterproof, and we take it to the workout.
So maybe in hockey specifically, did Moxy help you kind of figure out some of the game demands that you maybe didn't understand as well before? Did it shed some light on a few areas, or was that kind of already well understood, like the demands of hockey physiologically?
To be completely honest, we never had, I don't remember actually. I'm not sure if we ever put Moxys during actual, we did put it in practice, but never in competition.
Right.
I think because of regulations. I think that was the point why because we wanted to do it, right? Would have been very interesting, but I think there is like, because equipment wise, there is like regulations, what you can put on, what not. I was not sure if that was the problem, but during practice, we put it on, and yes, we could see some stuff, but also, to be honest and to be fair, we had to also, you can't make like conclusions out of it immediately. It's still a lot. Okay, some stuff we can replicate also during, for example, a workout to improve performance. We could see some transfer. Also, for example, if athletes were doing double shifts, for example, we could really see, okay, is there still oxygen in the upper body, for example? And most of the times there wasn't.
Right.
So we were not surprised if someone was like missing a shot or something, because there was no oxygen for the muscle to actually work properly.
Yeah. So maybe talk about that a little bit more and go into detail, because we don't think about it that way necessarily. At least not if we haven't been exposed to the Moxy, but all the resources that I use, say, for example, in the legs, when you're skating, that can, depending on the athlete and depending on the duration of effort and the intensity, draw blood away from other working muscles in the upper body, for example, which is not completely being used, and then have an impact on, coordination, precision of shots and stuff like that.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. That's actually was one of that because of Moxy, we understood more about this connection between, for example, upper body and lower body, and way more. Like you could visually see, for example, how someone was recovering his upper body. Sometimes the legs were recovering, but the upper body was like so late in recovery, it wasn't even ready for the next shift, for example.
Okay.
So, I mean, of course, this has an impact on performance. It doesn't mean that the athlete doesn't function anymore. That's not the case. Obviously, somehow it still works, but and it's also still interesting for me, still a question to actually have data on, for example, if someone was completely depleted in oxygen in the upper body and, for example, goal statistics or like precision in shooting.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a statistic yet. If there would be like that would be a really interesting comparison.
Yeah.
But what's also very fascinating about the Moxy is it almost always represents what the athlete feels. So if, for example, there is no, like the oxygen curve completely drops and he's actually basically bottom out, it's the same feeling for the athlete. He's like really struggling to keep up the performance. So that's something which gave us a lot of confidence that actually this technology works. So back to the upper body, if someone was like not recovered in the upper body, we could see it and he could also feel it. He could feel like still fatigue in the upper body. So which gave us a lot of confidence that there is some truth to it.
Yeah, behind the data that you're collecting. So talking about data collection, how did you, in the context of working with hockey players, how did you test and when did you organize those different tests across time?
Basically figured out the standard protocol. We tried to standardize the testing. So basically, what we did was like from blue line to goal line, like a sprint back and forth for 30 seconds, hard as you can. Well, first of all, you start on the bench to get the baseline, to see where you're at with the oxygen levels, and then you would go on the ice and then do the sprint 30 seconds, and then we would let the hockey players go back on the bench.
Yeah.
But beforehand, we would ask the hockey player, are you usually sitting or standing? So for example, if someone is used to standing, we would let him stand instead of sitting, just to see how it compares. And then he would go on the bench, and then after 2.5 minutes rest, which is like the average rest that a hockey player gets, more or less, it's like an average. And then he would go back on the ice, another 30 seconds, and we would do this for three shifts, basically. And almost every time, no one is not struggling in the last shift. So the idea was basically, what happens to your body if you push your body to the limit, and how many shifts do we need to do until we reach that point? So we had to figure out a test where we actually push the limit, but also it needs to be logistically for a whole team. If you want to test the whole team, it needs to be logistically doable. Like for one test, if you calculate 2.5 minutes, I think we were around 15 minutes, and you would test 3 guys or 4 guys at the same time, and you could do a whole team in like 2 hours. Which was very practical. So real, how do you say, like sport specific testing, but also standardize it and make it really easy, doable for the whole team, right? So it's that was what we did in the end with the 3 shifts.
So on the testing, did you see any significant difference between the people that recovered standing and the people that recovered sitting?
Yes. Well, not exactly the difference between not necessarily standing and sitting, but sometimes we would see, especially taller guys who were sitting down and actually constricting their blood vessels and their circulation, and therefore not getting optimal recovery. So we would tell them not either to sit higher or to actually stand for faster recovery.
Right.
Which is never considered. Like, you would never think to improve performance, instead of like doing actual workouts, you would give them tricks to how to sit, you know? Which was funny. And not just sitting, actually, it's also breathing. Breathing is very important. You could see how, if someone was recovering well, you would find, if someone was not recovering well, for example, the saturation curve would go very slowly up and very like a delayed recovery. We would look at also how the person would sit, for example, how he would breathe. So how is his breathing technique? Is there any restriction to his breathing and stuff? So, and that's really interesting to see with Moxy as well. You can actually put the Moxy on and try different breathing patterns, and you see the impact of your breathing just by doing nothing, which is also an interesting aspect for sure.
So what were the specific ways that you wanted your players to be breathing when they recovered? Was there some specific instruction person by person, or was it kind of a general prescription for the team of this is how you breathe to better recover in those interval times?
Right. Actually, we would always look at individually. So if someone in a test would have an optimal recovery curve, we would let him do whatever he was doing. Didn't want to change too much. But if someone would have a delayed recovery, we would give him specific protocols. If, for example, breathing was a problem. Of course, sometimes you need to do more tests to find the root of the problem. And sometimes, for example, with players with asthma, and even it was funny, like some players they had asthma before, but somehow you forget about it and you never had really some issues. And then you could see it on the Moxy, and then you would ask the players, hey, could it be that you had some history of asthma or something? He was like, hey, yeah, actually I had, you know. And you could see, okay, so with those guys, and actually that's actually well documented, the best improvement with like breathing training, for example, with a Spyro Tiger or any other good breathing protocols, the most they will benefit from would actually be the ones who have a breathing impairment. Okay. So if you would even prescribe it for everyone, the ones who have not such an issue, they wouldn't improve that much. And that was also our experience. Like, the best improvements were made with those guys who actually had a delayed recovery curve because of some breathing issues.
Right. That makes sense. Did you guys measure the distance covered in the 30 seconds on that 25-meter shuttle?
Yes. And but don't ask me how far they went. I have to look it up. I would be totally lying to think something out of my head.
more than the absolute numbers, what I'm interested in is, did you see any kind of correlation between the distance that they could or maybe couldn't repeat over the intervals, and then the nears trend in terms of the SO2? So like, how did those two connect?
Right, actually really well. You can see not just in ice hockey, in any other testing you're doing with the Moxy, as soon as the curve flattens out, performance drops drastically, like extreme. And it just makes sense, because your muscles are asking for oxygen, and the bigger your supply is, the supply means your breathing intake of oxygen and your cardiovascular system who can take the oxygen to your muscles. If it's really strong, of course, it takes maybe longer, or you can just have a bigger output. But if you don't have that good of a supply, when it's zero, it's really, you're not getting far anymore, or your coordination is way off. Like you're really not skating properly anymore, and you can see that completely. Like if they're skating, we also filmed the skating, and because we were not like absolute biomechanical experts in skating. We talked with the skating coach about it and what he could see during those times, and you could really see a decline in like coordination and skating skills. And just the upper body itself, like it really drops down, and it looks really lazy, right? The way they skate.
Right, because there's nothing left in the tank, and you have to use all the kind of secondary movers to try and do the job, and that's why you also see a shift in the pattern, the movement.
Totally,
they look the same, and so that's where the link is between the two. I know you talked about also doing off-ice testing, so you did those intervals on an air bike.
Right.
How did those two tests correlate? Between, I mean, for one athlete, did a trend that you saw on the ice kind of repeat itself off the ice as well, or was it sometimes very different results depending on the modality that they use, whether it's the bike or the ice?
It was highly dependent on the limitation the athletes had. For example, if it was, for example, a supply limitation, you could see more comparisons between the air bike and on the ice. But a demand limitation is very hard to see similarities. Sometimes yes, because if someone lacks really like leg strength, for example, a hockey player, it could also be, well, that could be the problem. But sometimes it's also because it's such a different skill, skating than like doing it on the air bike. It was really hard to actually, and we didn't really try to compare too much. Actually the air bike testing was we did it mostly with guys who didn't have access to the ice. Okay. That was like our substitute. We didn't test substitute. We didn't test the same athletes on the ice and on the air bike. Rarely. The other testing that we did was with the slide board, which might be a bit closer to ice hockey. And there we could see some better correlations, definitely. But here also, you could see guys who never did it on a slide board struggled with coordination. And then the problem might not be might not be physiologically limited. It might just be coordination.
Yeah, I guess that's an important distinction to make, is that when you're testing with Moxy, if you're getting the person, the client or the athlete to do a movement that they're not very proficient in, then the data you're going to pick up is not necessarily very representative of their physiology. Right?
Totally, absolutely. And I think that's also that's where we need the humility to actually say like, okay, it can be something else, not what we want sometimes, like the physiological, we can say like, hey, you're weak there, you need to work on that. Whereas maybe he doesn't need work in the gym, he needs work on the ice, for example, with a skate coach. Yeah, could be that too,
And going back to your point about you saw maybe more correlations if somebody was had a supply limitation, so delivery limitation from a cardiac standpoint, but you didn't see the same from a utilization standpoint. And would that be because, or one of the hypothesis behind that is that the central system is going to be taxed fairly similarly in those both cases, both on the ice and on the bike. But then when you go to the muscles themselves and recruitment patterns and the different movements between the ice and the bike, now we can see some pretty significant differences. But from the heart standpoint, the effort is fairly similar in both cases. Would that be a fair kind of analysis?
Totally. Although I would still say a yes or no, because imagine if you would go, like, are you good on the ice?
I'm not.
All right. So if you would go on the ice and you could skate just a little bit, just enough to get yourself exhausted in like an interval, you would get way more exhausted than someone like a hockey player if you would say like, okay, you know what, give it not even an all-out effort, just like a fast pace of skating. You would get really, because your coordination is way off, and you need more muscles, like not more muscles, you need more, everything is harder, you use more muscles, you're not as fluid in the movement.
You're not efficient. You're
not efficient, And then we see it in supply as well. Of course, you're going to breathe much harder. Of course, your body needs more oxygen because your coordination is off. So it actually goes hand in hand. So sometimes skill, sometimes your physiology expresses if your skill is good enough or not.
Which is a really important point, because we go back to the idea of you need to be really efficient at the way that you move and proficient with your different patterns you're going to have to replicate, whether you're skating on the ice, if you're running on the rugby field or something like that. Those things need to be addressed from a skill standpoint, and really trained optimally to then be able to express your physiology. Otherwise, it's going to limit you, right?
For sure. Like we had an example, a really good hockey, like skating wise, a fantastic hockey player. He would drop really nicely. Like he could empty his tank because he could use his muscles so well. He had no problem in using his muscles. It was obvious that he was just a very skilled skater. But it didn't mean that he has never a limitation. It just means he's just on a higher level. But for someone else, for example, if we also saw it with the other end of the spectrum, physically such a strong guy, but he was not a really good skater, and he would get sooner to a limitation. Doesn't mean his physiology, or it doesn't mean necessarily that we need to work on his fitness. Maybe, like I said before, we maybe have to work on his skills, which is often in a skill-based sport like ice hockey. It's so much more like all over the years, the importance of gym time definitely decreased for me.
For you, yeah. Because the skill of playing the game and being good with all your movements,
so important.
Yeah.
So many times I see athletes there are such good athletes, like training a lot, but they're not really good in their sport. It lacks more time doing the sport, and also, especially if you're not very talented, and they think like, yeah, I can, how do you say? I can
just maybe muscle through or push through this.
Yes, push, exactly. Like doing more work in the gym, which maybe might help me. Yes, maybe on certain level, but still, I see so much in skill-based sport that skill is so important. And you can see not just in ice hockey, in skiing as well, or imagine like freestyle snowboarding. You can be the fittest guy in the gym. If you can't really perform the tricks, and how do you want to get better at the tricks? Obviously, doing the tricks. Of course, there is like a reason to do good strength training, for example, just to keep you healthy and so you can perform more and have a longer career. Yes, I'm all in for that. But also with Moxy gave us the understanding that you have to really spend also a good amount of your time, or sometimes the problem is the skill.
Yeah, that's a conversation we've been having with Evan Picon quite a bit, talking about your cyclical ceiling, which you could, loosely coin VO2 max, if you will. And then you have your sport specific ceiling, which does take into account all the skills that you have to display in the game or in the sport. And for some sports, there's a big correlation between your cyclical results and then your sport results. For example, Nordic skiing. But then if you go to biathlon, now the results don't correlate because you got to shoot a gun, and that's a skill.
Interesting. Yes.
Right. And so there are maybe sports where you could benefit more from pushing your physiology, but you need to make sure your skill is in line. And then other sports where the skill is so, there's such a demand for the skill of the sport or the game that maybe pushing your physiology to the max isn't going to have such a big impact on your sports performance.
Totally. Like if I think of track and field and sprinting, and to be really honest, I read a lot about it, but I was never like a track and field guy, although I find it very fascinating and interesting. But there, I totally understand why sometimes you just have the same coach in the weight room and on the track.
Mm-hmm.
And some of course some like strength and conditioning coaches would argue that you need to separate this and blah blah blah. I understand that point as well, but I also totally makes sense because skill is, I wouldn't say more important, but it's very important in sprinting. And he would have, the guy who would do both, he would have the eye. Usually they're really good sprint coaches. He would have the eye if he had the skill on that day, and if he would be doing more sprints or less, and depending on that he would adjust the weight training. So it makes sense for me that someone who is well versed in both sides, or even more in skills on the skill side, it would totally make sense to take care of both.
Yeah, especially if you have a really good understanding of your sport demands and the strength and the power and the conditioning and all that goes into it. Where like you said, it's like the perfect package as a sports coach blended in with a performance, like a physical prep coach.
That would be.
Yeah, which we, like you said, see in those sports, track and field, weightlifting, gymnastics as well.
Right. Yes.
And
totally.
maybe what we need is to bridge that gap in maybe team sports where we have that big segregation between sport, technical, tactical coaches, and then the physical prep coaches, and maybe find a way to bridge that gap to, work closer together and actually have more continuity between the skill and then the performance as well.
On my side, for example, I work with mountain bikers, but I'm really interested in mountain biking, and it has become a really big hobby of mine the last couple of years. And my skill is improving as well, and that's helping me tremendously to understand what the guys actually need. And I can also understand and see things that I haven't seen before, that I could see like, oh, okay, so actually this skill, for example, body position on the mountain bike, if it's changing, it gives me like a hint of how he's feeling and stuff, where before, if I don't know the sport enough or haven't felt it myself, it was harder to understand and to see those limitations. And you can adjust it not even by doing specific training, but just like, for example, tell him, hey, you know what, take it easy on this section and push the other section, which is also a great advice in itself, for example. Or be mindful that you put your pressure on the outside foot during this turn, right? Which is not directly physiological improvement, but it's just giving him a skill-based hint for improvement.
But at the same time, those two do end up blending kind of in the middle, right? There is that middle ground, that gray area where the skill and the performance side come together, and it's that's where the magic happens usually, when everything is working together. But it makes it that much harder to kind of break down and coach.
Totally. And that's why also with the whole testing, when we introduced Moxy into the world of testing, there was quite a lot of resistance as well, like in the hockey teams and clubs, and especially from the traditional testing side. Also, and for me, it made total sense, like we were talking now about all the aspects. You would understand that, for example, why should you test a hockey player, which is his main sport, and test him on a bike to test his physiological performance. I understand that there is like a progress in like technology, and on one time it was good enough, this kind of testing, but as we improve technology, I think it is very important to be open and see actually the possibilities, for example, that you could actually test more specific. But that was something was really not easy to get. Still nowadays, like skiers, for example, still have to do the treadmill VO2 max test.
Really? A treadmill one?
Sorry, not treadmill. Sorry, on the bike. Sorry.
Oh, okay, on the bike. Yeah.
Yeah. it's fine to compare data from 10 years ago, but still there is nothing is happening there. It's still the same stuff since 20 years, which is crazy, right?
It is. So we talked about hockey quite a bit. Did you get a chance to use Moxy extensively with other sports, other athletes that you've worked with over the years?
Yes, absolutely. Mostly, like right now, I don't have too many hockey. Actually, right now, I've not one hockey player. Right now. Right now, I have skiers, where I'm using the Moxy. I really like to use it there also for in training. For example, what I really like to do is more specific work. It's with, I don't know if you heard of the Quantum, the 1080 motion. No?
Oh, is it the indoor Quantum, the one with we can move in different planes and all that stuff?
Yeah, like it's basically like a cable machine. Looks like a Kaiser, but a bigger one.
Yeah, I'd never seen one. I saw one yesterday. I was in Macklingen, and they have
nice.
one.
Yeah, exactly. They have it there. So I really like, because it gives you amazing performance data as well. And I try to, like, for example, we would do like a skiing position squat, and quite fast, like a half a second per rep, like, or 1 second per full rep, up and down, right? The skiing position, I would put Moxys on, and then we would do intervals there, like, and base it off. We can also see the every rep, the watts, and then it would really overlay really well, like the performance output with the watts compared to the Moxy physiological data. The curve is like 1-to-1 basically. It's really well. You can see it really well, really close. So skiing, really like to do it. With mountain biking, I have done it as well, especially with the downhill guys, because what they need is actually sprinting power, and also it's quite interval based, even though they have like sometimes like 4-minute run, and the heart rate goes up and stays up there, but sometimes they have to do like really hard sprints in between. So it's also interesting to work with the Moxy, because we do a lot of interval. So for them, it's very important to be able to repeat their sprints on the highest, on the maximum. So maximum output a couple of times in their run, right?
Yeah. Is there, so with all your experience, different sports, different athletes, different limitations as well. If we talk about a delivery limitation or cardiac limitation, respiratory limitation, utilization limitation, in your mind, is there one that maybe sticks out as being easier to train than the other ones? And then maybe one that is harder than the other ones, or do they all kind of hold each other in terms of, how hard or how accessible it is to actually improve those limitations?
That's a hard one, because it really depends on the athlete. I would say it's tough, because if you look at, I try to compare like supply limitation and demand limitation, which would be easier to train, but that's such a hard question, because the limitation can be cardiovascular or respiratory in the supply.
Yeah.
And sometimes what I would say, like, for example, it's still hard if someone has a respiratory limitation to train it properly.
Would that be the hardest one to train out of the three?
That's a difficult one. Yes, that's a difficult one. But what's easier, if someone has a muscular limitation, like you could see like it's a muscular limitation, and you do strength training, for example, you would see improvements pretty soon in like better desaturation. That would be something. But compared all over the sports, that's hard to tell.
Yeah. Do you also use, so you talk about strength training to improve a utilization limitation? Would you use some short, intense interval work as well in that realm?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Like for me, demand utilization limitation, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do like short intervals on like all out effort. It also means to incorporate strength training, especially with the, for example, with the quantum, we could test. So the first thing, if we look at the utilization limitation, of course, is it a skill problem? And to answer this question, the best would be if you do a strength test. Mm-hmm. So you do a strength test, and then you can see how good or bad someone is in like rate of force development and peak force, or like if you have like even like a counter movement jump test where you see average or peak power, and then you would see, okay, actually it might really be a skill problem if someone is quite strong. Mm-hmm. But for example, if someone is really good in skill and we see bad strength numbers, we know, okay, we need to work on his strength for sure. Mm-hmm. So for demand limitation, there is multiple options that you can do. You can do strength training, you can do really short intervals. You can do, for example, sprints, which is also basically like a HIIT, high intensity workout. Mm-hmm. But with supply, it's more obvious if it's not respiratory. Mm-hmm. With supply, you try to push the cardiac system. Of course, for a hockey player, it's going to be different than, for example, an enduro mountain biker where he has to pedal the whole day, right?
Mm-hmm. Is in that supply realm, so trying to improve cardiac output, really generally, is there a really high importance of using specific means of preparation? For example, for an ice skater, so for a hockey player, do you want him to do all this cardiac, quote unquote, cardiac or supply work on ice, or can a lot of that, since it's essential kind of adaptation we're after, can that be done more easily on a general, modality, let's say?
That's a really good question. I would actually, the approach usually would be like any good, I don't know. I think good strength program or like, a physical preparation program, you would go from general to like more specific. Mm-hmm. So basically what we did was we did it general, for example, intervals on an air bike, or you could even jog, but we did a lot with the air bike or like sled pushing for a certain amount of minutes. Mm-hmm. And then move from there to, for example, on the slide board. And then from there, the ideal way would be on the ice, but we never really had proper access for supply training. But that would be amazing. If you would say like, okay, you do this 4-minute interval on the ice, and because you're doing supply training, you're not going all out, you can really work on technique as well, which I think is fantastic. Right. That would be a really cool supply training for a hockey player. Right. It's more specific area.
But then if we, if we talk about, for example, to look at the other side, a utilization limitation. So from a muscular standpoint, is there any point doing general training there, or do you want to go straight to specific in terms of the movement pattern that you're going to be using?
Same here. We would go, if it's like if we see someone struggling, and it's always because all the puzzle pieces. So if someone has, we test them and he has a strength deficiency, we would work him unspecific, like whatever. You can do squats, single leg squats, whatever. Mostly I really like single leg squats because it's unilateral as well, the sport. So, and from there we would move to, sorry, I got to completely, because it's such a good track right now in the background.
What is it? What is it? We want to know. We want to know.
Oh, it's from a playlist from SoundCloud. It's electro. But it's really awesome. It's really cool.
Well, you'll have to send it to me afterwards.
Oh yeah, totally. I don't know if you like electro, but
yeah, for sure.
I have to actually, let me look quickly.
Go ahead.
So I know where it is, so I can send it to you.
I'll put it in the show note descriptions for all the people that are glad we've interrupted our chat to talk about music.
We 1 minute 23. So I'll send you later the name of the track. So back to strength training. So we would go from unspecific to specific, and there as well, of course, that's where we could do a bit more. We would talk to the coach and say, like, can you incorporate some sprints? And we give you the sets and reps and rest. But it was still, we were at the time, it was still hard. I mean, it's easier when you work with a team, but with a single athlete, if someone is a hockey player comes to me, it's really hard to do that because you would have to have an ice rink for yourself.
Yeah.
Like, it's really hard to do that. So what we did, for example, would be hill sprints with inline skates.
Okay.
If the guy has ever done inline skates before. Because it's not the same, but it's quite close. So that would be, we did sprints on inline skates to improve skill, but also to improve power, basically.
Yeah, so almost using the hill as you would do either resisted sprints or hill sprints as a means to provide some, almost natural resistance to a sprint that you're doing.
Yes.
You would do the same on the inline. Okay.
Actually, on one point we also did like really steep sprints with the Moxys.
Okay.
And that's also something really cool because you can take the device outside with your laptop and base it off there. That's some really cool tool as well.
And maybe you want to touch on the last limitation that we haven't spoke about a lot, respiratory limitation. Like you said, that might be a harder one to train because there is so many components to it. There's the frequency, the volume, there's the coordination of, respiratory muscles like the diaphragm. There's the whole inspiration versus expiration, CO2, O2 balance. So how did you approach those respiratory limitations? And did you find any effective ways to actually get improvements, maybe out of people that did not have prior respiratory problems, like you mentioned about the asthma folks? Oh, your volume is cut. Can't hear you anymore. No, maybe check on the...
You hear me now?
That's good now, yeah.
Okay, I have to put in the headphones again. Can you hear me now?
It works, go ahead.
Okay, perfect, all right. Good question, because that's an area of this I'm very fascinated about, the whole breathing stuff. Respiratory, I started to incorporate respiratory training in general with almost all of my athletes, regardless of Moxy or not.
Okay.
But I think there is some really interesting benefits also using it with Moxy. So basically, it's not just about breathing patterns that I try to coach. It's more about also manipulating CO2 resistance. So there is a really cool book by Patrick McKeown. I think it's really hard for me to say.
The Oxygen Advantage?
But it's called, yes, exactly, yes.
I'm reading it right now.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah,
so cool. Yeah.
I'm halfway through.
So awesome. So this one, and then there's another book. It's called Breathe.
That's my next one. It's on. My wife is reading it right now.
Perfect. Perfect.
I got Brian to recommend the best breathing books that he could, and that's what he gave me.
Perfect. So and the other thing is, I started for myself. I think it's 4 years now. I did Wim Hof. I started Wim Hof, and I've been doing it consistently until now. And I adjusted the protocols a little bit, and Wim Hof is a bit different. It's actually, sometimes you would say, quite the opposite of what Patrick McKeown would say. But with the Patrick McKeown kind of like CO2 manipulation, I started doing it 2 years ago with my athletes, and I saw some quite good improvements, even though they were not like, they didn't have any respiratory limitation. Mostly the most benefits with the method from Patrick is from the Oxygen Advantage is better recovery. and the you can do something for much longer. That was like the two main benefits. So for example, the skiers, they would have less fatigue, especially if because during summer they would go high in the mountains, and they would sleep on like 1,800, which is already very high, and train on 3,000.
Oh, really?
Yes. So yeah, like 2,800 to 3,000. So it's very high. And if you basically, you're actually simulating in the off season, you're simulating the high altitude training with the athletes with the method from Oxygen Advantage.
Right.
So there we could see some really good benefits. Like one skier, he was not able to walk 20 steps when he started the off season, and by the end of the off season, he could breath hold for 80 steps, which is amazing.
Right.
So 80 steps breath hold is quite a lot. And he could feel you're not like more powerful or more, you have not more strength and stuff like that. That was not the case on all the cases, all the athletes I trained, but in general, just like better recovery and you could do just things longer.
Yeah.
I think especially for endurance athletes, it's very interesting because they're,
It's interesting. I was thinking about this last night. Actually, going to bed, I got up and I wrote a note in the Patrick's book to remember it, and it just came back now. Would you say that, or the way that I saw it, maybe I'm wrong, but those CO2 protocols, kind of nose breathing at low intensities, kind of try to be as efficient as you can with your breathing, because it's about doing as little work as possible for a given outcome. I was wondering if coupling those CO2 protocols, so that almost like, if you want to call it endurance or baseline work for the respiratory system, and then coupling that with some more strength oriented work on the diaphragm and the respiratory system in general, just like you would, push sprint speed for a rugby player to increase his speed reserve, could you do the same to kind of build up a respiratory reserve between maximum breathing capacity and strength and then actual levels that are needed in the game? And essentially, by making the the respiratory system more robust, more powerful, more stronger,
right.
Could you improve your breathing efficiency in general? Have you played with any of that?
Actually, we did some kind of work, because you can actually, I hear sound. Why is that?
I still hear you.
Hold on. Okay. All right. So you can actually combine these two things. So for example, because you should basically nose breathe all the time. And especially if you're doing a hard interval session and you try to nose breathe, you automatically have to use way more diaphragm muscles to just get the amount of air in that you need, right? And also to exhale and get the CO2 out. So just naturally, you have a better breathing pattern just because you breathe through the nose. And that's also the theory behind Patrick McKeown. He doesn't really talk much about improving breathing patterns. He just says like, mostly you're going to improve because just you nose breathe, right? And sometimes you would actually combine this with like breath holds during hard intervals, but that's like an advanced method.
Right.
And then you would release and then just breathe through the nose. And for example, I would coach athletes to actually breathe in through the nose really hard through the diaphragm and then hold the breath for like 3 seconds and then breathe out again, and then try to make the breath as long as possible. And then stop again for 3 seconds and then breathe out again. And usually I would look at the athlete, how it would breathe, if it would use chest or stomach, but in almost all of the cases, diaphragm cannot say it in English. Diaphragm breathing. Diaphragmatic
breath. Yeah, diaphragmatic breathing.
Exactly. You can see they do it naturally. If you give them this protocol with like the breath holds, they have to do it. You cannot do it just chest breathing, almost impossible. And so that's where I think you can have the benefit of increasing CO2 tolerance, but also tackling breathing pattern or breathing muscle, basically training, right? Yeah. And also there is still another option to use Spiro Tiger, but I think that's quite an expensive option to breathe, to train your diaphragmatic muscles or your breathing pattern. I think with the methods that you have with the breath hold and the hard intervals, for example, you can really have some benefits without the Spiro Tiger.
That's fantastic information, Arno. Thank you so much for sharing all that. I want to be respectful of your time. I have one more question for you. Can you talk a little bit more about Origym, about what you just built, about what the idea behind it is, and where you want to take it in the future? Go for it.
Sure. So Origym is all about having fun, like I've said before. It's about a special kind of atmosphere. Like for me, it's like, how can a training be fun? So for me, very important is music, good people, good coaches, a good community, interesting surrounding with a good atmosphere. And we try to all combine that. So we built a place where we also combined design and function. So we really thought things through, like the floor area is very nice looking, but also at the same time it has great function as well. Same with our lighting system, where we can change colors and stuff. So it gives a really specific and unique atmosphere. It's more about like a feeling, because it's not about just like weight training or endurance training or flexibility. It's everything you need to live a happy and fulfilled life. And people here in the mountains, usually they like the outdoors a lot. And this is also something, if you want to balance and have fun on the outdoor and balance it, you can balance it with training in here, which gives you more reward and more fun to go outside. So that's like the idea, to just give the people the possibility to get fit in a really cool environment where actually training is fun. And we have like our workouts. So if you go on the website, you can find the workouts, and every workout has their own specific idea and name behind it. And the coach who coaches it is like really authentic. He's like, you can feel like the connection why the workout is like that, because it's of the coach. So it's love to the details, and it's about really having a good time. And I think if you come in here, we have a really nice lounge, and you can drink coffee, and this is all everything else. And we have cool t-shirts and stuff like that. It's like just a place where you can just feel good.
Right. More than just a gym.
Right. Exactly. Not just exactly, but also still like the equipment we have is really top notch. It's really cool stuff. We got a lot from Rogue, and we didn't. We also have a Kaiser. We have a Turf. We have really good like bumper plates and barbells. So for even like CrossFitters, for example, who want to spend some holiday days, they find an amazing gym here. And also for like bigger groups, because it's quite big. It's 350 square meters, and even an outside turf area. It's also good for retreats and all these kind of things. Yeah.
Oh, that's really fantastic. I look forward to visiting one day when I'm in the area. Arno, where can people find out more about you and what you do online?
So best would be just go on origym.ch. Or Instagram. It's also at origym.ch, and we actually are quite active on Instagram. If someone wants to get in touch, you can write me an email on allegra@origym.ch as well. Our old website, Elite Training, is very old. I wouldn't go on there. Just maybe you can see so what we've done in the past, but yeah, it's an old website.
Right. Well, I'll link the Origym website and the Instagram in the show notes. So for all the listeners and the viewers, go check out what Arno is doing at Origym in Scuol. Arno, I really appreciate you taking the time for the call today.
Thanks a lot for having me. It was a lot of fun, and you're a really cool host.
I appreciate that very much, and have a great day.
Thank you.